Just a nurse. That's what they called her in the break room when they thought she couldn't hear. Just a nurse with faded scrubs 2 sizes too big, darning a torn pocket with suture thread during her lunch break, hunched over a styrofoam container of reheated chicken like she had nowhere else to be. Just a nurse who never complained about double shifts, never asked for a day off, never made eye contact when Dr. Pierce walked past her station. He didn't see what his eyes actually registered. He didn't see the way her hands moved with surgical precision as she repaired that seam, each stitch identical, exactly 3 millimeters apart, the muscle memory of someone who'd sutured wounds in places where infection meant amputation. He didn't see the way her shoulders sat, spine straight even when she was bent over a break room table, the kind of posture that came from carrying trauma litters through enemy territory. He didn't see the legend whispered in Kandahar safe houses by soldiers who'd survived things that shouldn't be survivable. Angel 6. The medic who walked into hell and carried out the living. Danielle Ross moved through the VA wing of St. Michael's in Colorado Springs like a ghost wearing someone else's uniform. Her competence was so quiet that colleagues didn't notice. She never hesitated, never second-guessed, never panicked. They noticed her hands. They didn't notice what her hands could do. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless drone over linoleum floors slick with disinfectant. The smell hit you first when you entered the unit, that specific hospital smell, part bleach, part decay, part the antiseptic surrender of people whose bodies had already quit fighting. Danielle checked vitals on the forgotten patients. The paralyzed. The brain damaged. The ones whose families stopped visiting after the 3rd month. She moved from room to room with a clipboard and a pen, recording numbers that would be filed and forgotten, taking blood pressures on men and women who stared at ceiling tiles like they might hold answers. Room for 12, David Kellerman, stroke patient, no visitors in 14 months. She adjusted his pillow, checked the feeding tube, whispered something gentle that nobody heard. Room for 14, Maria Gonzalez, dementia, thrashing at night, calm during the day. Danielle's voice dropped lower when she spoke to Maria, the way it always did, like softness was medicine. Room for 16, empty this morning. They'd moved the patient to hospice at 6 a.m. She changed the sheets anyway, crisp hospital corners pulled tight, because someone should. Because protocol existed for a reason. Inside her locker jacket lining, sewn with the same careful stitches she'd just used on her pocket, a faded Special Forces unit patch waited in the dark. No one had noticed it in 3 years. No one had looked closely enough. Her hands trembled slightly when she handled medications, a tremor she developed 6 months ago that wouldn't stop, even now, even after all this time. She hid it by gripping clipboards tighter, by keeping her movements brisk and businesslike, by never letting anyone see her hold the same object for longer than necessary. When she walked, there was the faintest limp in her left leg, barely perceptible unless you knew what to look for. A piece of shrapnel, still embedded near the femur, that the surgeons decided was safer left alone than removed. It ached when the weather changed. It ached most of the time. 3 years of wearing scrubs that hung loose on her shoulders. 3 years of being the nurse nobody asked about. 3 years since they'd erased her records, issued her a new social security number, and told her to disappear into America like she'd never existed. The instruction had been clear: you were never there. No one in Kandahar knew you. The operation is classified. If you surface, you compromise active operatives. So she didn't surface. She worked nights and weekends, took the shifts no one else wanted, lived in a 2-bedroom apartment near the base where nobody paid attention to their neighbors. She was good at being invisible. She'd had practice. The morning shift started at 7. Danielle arrived at 6:40, 15 minutes early like always, clocking in through a system that reduced her to a number. Her badge photo had been taken 3 years ago when she'd first hired on, and she looked like a different person then, eyes that still expected the world to make sense, before months of 12-hour shifts and VA patients and the slow realization that some wounds never closed. She tied her dark hair back with a rubber band, smoothed down the front of her scrubs, and pulled the chart for the morning rounds. That's when she heard the footsteps. Dr. Pierce moved through the hospital like he owned it, and technically, from his perspective, he did. His white coat was crisp, not a wrinkle, not a stain. His shoes gleamed with a shine that suggested someone else polished them. His smile was sharp as broken glass and approximately as warm. Behind him trailed 2 residents and a medical student, all of them orbiting his attention like planets with no gravity of their own. He reviewed charts, dictated orders, and moved through the VA wing with the casual authority of someone who'd never been told no. Danielle watched him arrive from the corner of her eye, filing medications into the locked cabinet with practiced efficiency. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She knew the sound of men like Dr. Pierce, the particular cadence of their confidence, the way they took up space like they'd purchased the oxygen. She'd served with men like him too, once, before everything changed. Men who led from the front and men who led from behind, and the difference between them was the difference between life and death. Mr. Hawthorne in for 18, Pierce announced to his residents, not bothering to look at the chart. Post-stroke rehab, 6 months in. What are we doing with him? One of the residents stumbled through an answer. Danielle heard the hesitation, heard the uncertainty. She continued filing medications, her hand steady now, the tremor vanished when she focused. Around the locked cabinet hung a calendar showing the date, March 17th. The air conditioning kicked in with a metallic shudder. One of the residents coughed. Wrong, Pierce said. We're preparing him for discharge. Beds needed for acute admissions. Family's been contacted. We're trying to locate. Try harder. I don't care if you have to call the numbers backward. Move him to transitional care this week. Next patient. Danielle slid the medication drawer closed with a soft click and turned, clipboard in hand. That's when she saw him, saw the way Pierce's eyes flickered across her like she was furniture, assessed her in that half-second way that doctors developed, the ability to categorize human beings by their usefulness to the institution. She was mid-range usefulness. A competent nurse. No drama. No complaints. Forgettable. Nurse, he said, not bothering with her name. The dressing changes on the VA patients this morning, I want them done with 3% hydrogen peroxide. Not the standard protocol. I'm trying something new with the wound healing metrics. Understood, doctor, she said quietly. He was already moving toward the next room. She stood there for a moment, clipboard against her chest, and watched the way he moved. There was something wrong in his approach, something clinically wrong. The hydrogen peroxide concentration was too high for that particular patient population. It would damage healthy tissue, actually slow healing, cause pain without benefit. But he was the doctor. And she was just a nurse. The morning continued in the rhythm it always did. Vitals. Medications. Wound care. The patients received her attention like it was the most natural thing in the world, like they deserved it, like their broken bodies and damaged minds were worth the time she gave them. She moved between rooms with the economy of motion that came from 1,000 repetitions, from understanding that wasted movement meant wasted seconds and seconds could mean shock, sepsis, death. Her hands moved on their own, guided by something deeper than conscious thought. The fluorescent lights hummed. The heart monitor in 416 beeped its steady rhythm. A patient called out from 420, and she was there before the call button finished lighting. Just a nurse. Except her hands had held together the chest cavity of a Green Beret who'd taken shrapnel meant for 4 other soldiers. Except she could perform an emergency thoracotomy with a combat knife if she had to. Except she'd kept people alive in conditions where staying alive wasn't supposed to be possible. She kept moving. The new admission came through at 9:47 in the morning. The chart arrived first, handed off to the VA wing coordinator by an ER nurse who looked exhausted. Danielle glanced at the name, Jenkins, Marcus A., age 41, paralyzed from the waist down, admitted from a private facility in Denver, referred for long-term care and rehabilitation. Nothing unusual. The VA wing received steady admissions. Nothing unusual at all. Then the patient arrived. They wheeled him through on a hospital bed, his frame lean and muscled despite the paralysis, his head turned toward the window like he was searching for something outside that he wouldn't find. Danielle was helping Mr. Chen with his physical therapy in the hallway when she saw the tattoo. A call sign, written in black ink across the patient's forearm in military block letters. Angel 6. Her hand stopped moving. The clipboard fell. It hit the linoleum with a sound like the world breaking. Mr. Chen, confused, looked at her. "Nurse? You okay?" She couldn't speak. She couldn't breathe. The hallway had become very narrow and very long, and the fluorescent lights seemed impossibly bright, the hum of them loud enough to drown out thought. She picked up the clipboard with hands that were no longer steady, that had started to tremble again for reasons she couldn't afford to name. The paralyzed man on the bed, Marcus Jenkins, the chart said, though that name meant nothing, turned his head toward her. His eyes passed over her without recognition. Not a flicker. Not a moment of connection. Just the vacant gaze of someone looking at a nurse, one of a dozen nurses, one of 100 people in white coats and scrubs who'd become part of the blurred landscape of his recovery. She had carried him 3 miles through enemy territory. She had kept his heart pumping when it wanted to stop. She had whispered to him in the dark, "Stay with me. Stay with me. I've got you." Nobody dies on my watch, and he had stayed, had survived, had fought his way back to consciousness in a field hospital and then stateside and then into this place, this room, this moment where he looked directly at the woman who'd saved his life and saw nothing at all. The old wound opened. Not a physical wound. Something deeper. Something that had scabbed over imperfectly, something that had learned to live with the pain but would never fully close. "Jenkins to 421, the orderly said, and they wheeled him past her toward his room. She stood in the hallway, clipboard held tight, and watched him disappear. The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere, a monitor beeped. A doctor's voice called out an order. The hospital continued, as it always did, indifferent to the moment that had just fractured something she'd spent 3 years carefully reconstructing. She had no idea what was about to walk through those doors. She had no idea that her old life was about to arrive on a wheelchair and tear through everything she'd built in the quiet. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came when Dr. Pierce walked past the patient's room, glanced at the chart, and then did something he'd never done before. He stopped. He backtracked. He stood in the doorway of room 421 and stared at Captain Danielle Ross standing beside the bed of Marcus Jenkins, the paralyzed Green Beret from Kandahar, and his expression changed. Not with recognition. With calculation. He saw something in the way she stood. In the way her hand lingered on the patient's vitals chart. In the way her eyes, for just a moment, had stopped being empty. He saw a problem that needed solving. Dr. Pierce's eyes tracked her the way a predator tracks wounded prey. She stood at the bedside of the paralyzed Green Beret, Marcus Jenkins, according to the chart, though the tattoo on his forearm told a different story. Angel 6. Grid coordinates beneath it. Her hands trembled as she adjusted his pillow, a gesture that took 3 seconds too long, and when she turned away, her jaw clenched so tight he could see the muscle working beneath her skin. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Just one tear. That was all it took. Pierce understood human weakness better than most doctors. He'd been running the VA wing overbilling scheme for 18 months, phantom procedures, inflated codes, procedures scheduled for patients who couldn't possibly need them. $740,000 in unauthorized billing, and no one had noticed because the paralyzed, the forgotten, the ones with no families to advocate for them didn't ask questions. Didn't file complaints. Didn't even know what treatments appeared on their charts. It was beautiful, really. Efficient. Until a nurse lingered too long at a bedside and cried where anyone could see her. Emotional attachment meant loose lips. Loose lips meant audits. Audits meant federal prison. He made a mental note. Danielle Ross. He already knew her type, military bearing, outdated scrubs from Goodwill, the kind of woman who didn't complain when scheduled for the overnight shifts nobody wanted. She'd never caused problems. That was precisely why this moment required decisive action. Problems needed to be identified and eliminated before they metastasized. Tuesday morning, he made his move. Danielle was charting in Marcus's room when Pierce arrived with 2 residents trailing behind him like remoras following a shark. The old man's daughter sat in the corner, reading something on her phone, barely looking up. Perfect witness. Perfect audience. Nurse Ross, Pierce said, his voice pitched loud enough to carry down the hallway. Are you crying? She didn't flinch. Didn't turn around. Just set down her pen with deliberate precision and faced him, her expression flat as concrete. Checking his drainage tube, doctor. In tears. He stepped closer, his presence filling the small room like pressure. This is a medical facility, not a grief counseling center. If you can't maintain professional boundaries with patients, perhaps you should work somewhere less demanding. Like a daycare. He smiled at the residents, the kind of smile that had humiliated medical students for 15 years. Wouldn't want emotion contaminating our clinical judgment, would we? The daughter's shoulders tensed. She looked away from her phone, caught between witnessing something she shouldn't and not knowing how to leave without making it worse. Danielle's eyes met his for exactly 2 seconds. That was the moment he knew for certain she was dangerous. Most people would have argued. Would have explained. Would have cried or fought back or let shame color their face red. She did none of those things. She simply looked at him with the eyes of someone who had seen him clearly and found him wanting, and then she returned to her charting as if he'd already left the room. He hadn't. Not by a long shot. By Wednesday, the nickname had made the rounds through the nursing staff like a virus, clearance rack. Because her scrubs came from Goodwill, because she wore them without the newer polyester blends everyone else favored, because she looked like someone shopping the clearance aisle. Pierce let it take root. Never said it himself, that would be traceable, but he didn't correct the residents when they used it during morning rounds. Clearance rack, what's the wound status on our Green Beret? And the room would shift, energy changing just slightly, everyone understanding the hierarchy. Everyone understanding who was marked. Thursday came hard. Danielle entered the break room at 12:51 p.m., her lunch packed in a plastic container, leftovers, probably, something she'd made at home to avoid the cafeteria. For nurses were there Sandra from the day shift, Jennifer from nights, 2 newer RNs whose names Pierce had never bothered learning. Danielle sat at the corner table. Opened her container. The room didn't go immediately silent, that would be too obvious. Instead, conversations continued for approximately 15 seconds, then Sandra stood, then Jennifer, then both newer nurses found reasons to leave. Chairs scraped. One nurse mentioned needing to check on a patient who didn't exist. Another suddenly had charting to finish. Within 90 seconds, Danielle sat alone with her sandwich and the fluorescent lights humming their mechanical drone, the vending machine beside her casting a sickly glow across plastic-wrapped snacks. She ate anyway. Didn't rush. Didn't cry. Finished every bite with the mechanical efficiency of someone refueling a machine. The only tell was the way her hand paused halfway to her mouth, jaw tightening, and then resuming. That tiny break in composure was the only thing that betrayed the cost of her silence. Friday brought the disciplinary write-up. Pierce posted it on the unit board where everyone would see it, the pink slip laminated and pinned beneath the staff birthday calendar and the HIPAA reminder. Deed Ross, emotional involvement with patients. Excessive time at bedside. Counseling required. He'd handwritten a note at the bottom, 3rd violation may result in termination. She read it at 7:34 a.m., before the morning shift started. Danielle stood in front of the board for 14 seconds, her hands at her sides, her breathing steady. One tear escaped, just one, and she wiped it without breaking eye contact with the paper, as if she were reading a diagnosis instead of her own professional death sentence. Then she clocked in for her shift. But that wasn't the worst part. That afternoon, Pierce noticed her in the records room during her break. Not on break, reviewing charts. His charts. The ones from the VA wing. She was cross-referencing Marcus's procedure codes against his actual wound status, running her finger down the billing timestamps, comparing them to shift logs. Her expression didn't change, but her shoulders had gone rigid with the kind of tension that comes from seeing something you can't unsee. She was looking for discrepancies. She was looking for him. The paralyzed Green Beret had been scheduled for 3 debridement procedures in 7 days. Marcus's wounds were clean, had been clean since day 3. The procedures were phantom billings, $7,000 each, 3 phantom wounds in a man who'd already paid the price of war with his entire lower body. Danielle saw it. He could tell from the way her eyes moved across the numbers, connecting dots that most nurses never noticed. Pierce left her alone that day. Let her search. Let her see. Let her understand exactly how deep this ran and how exposed it would become if she spoke. He made a note in her personnel file citing her access to confidential VA records without authorization, a violation of Hospital Policy 47C, Chain of Command Procedures. He scheduled her for night shifts, rotating her away from day staff, away from witnesses, away from allies. That night, during the midnight round, Marcus whispered in his sleep. Angel 6. Angel 6. Danielle stood in the dark doorway of his room, watching the paralyzed Green Beret call out for someone he'd forgotten, someone who'd carried him 3 miles through Kandahar crossfire with his blood soaking through her uniform as mortars fell. His lips moved without sound for a moment, and then his eyes opened, those vacant eyes that had never recognized her, and they looked through her like she was a ghost. She closed the door quietly. By morning, there was a formal written warning in her personnel file. Pierce had flagged her questioning of the spinal tap he'd scheduled for Marcus, a procedure absolutely unnecessary given the man's spinal cord transection, a procedure that would generate a billable code. Danielle had written a note in the chart, medical necessity unclear. Recommend oncology consult before proceeding. Practicing medicine without a license. Insubordination. Questioning physician orders. All documented. All building toward the moment when he would have no choice but to fire her. He found her in the hallway Friday evening, walking out of Marcus's room. Her shift was ending. Pierce stepped into her path with the kind of careful concern that had fooled hospital administrators for decades. Danielle, he said quietly. I'm worried about you. She stopped. Waited. Her posture didn't change, but something in her eyes shifted, just a slight hardening, like a door closing behind glass. These paranoid accusations about procedures, Pierce continued, his voice dropping into the register of genuine concern. This obsessive checking of charts. This emotional instability we've seen all week. He paused, let the weight of the moment settle. Maybe you need a psychiatric evaluation before you hurt someone. For your own good. And the patient's. Danielle was quiet for a full 3 seconds. The hallway around them emptied, visiting hours over, shift change occurring in real time, the hospital briefly caught between one rhythm and another. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat as steel. I need to get going, she said. She walked around him without waiting for permission. Without breaking stride. Without giving him anything else to use. Pierce watched her disappear down the corridor toward the exit, her shoulders squared, her steps measured, and he smiled to himself. The documentation was complete. The case was airtight. By Monday, security would walk her out and she would disappear from St. Michael's as completely as she'd disappeared 18 years ago after Kandahar, after the operation that officially never happened, after they'd erased her records and given her a new identity and told her never to surface. He had no idea who she really was. Wednesday morning at 6:19 a.m., the cardiac unit at St. Michael's hummed with the ordinary rhythms of post-operative recovery. Machines beeped in steady intervals. Nurses moved between rooms with clipboards and fresh for bags. In room for 12, a man named Samuel Kowalski, 68 years old, 23 years retired from the 5th Special Forces Group, 3 days post-op from a coronary artery bypass, sat on the edge of his bed with his feet searching for the floor. His surgical gown hung loose over bandages that ran the length of his sternum like a zipper holding his chest together. Dr. Pierce had ordered ambulation. Walking prevents blood clots, he'd said that morning, his voice carrying the casual authority of a man who'd never had to question his own instructions. 2 laps around the unit. Slow and steady. Danielle stood at the crash cart station near the nursing desk, mechanically restocking supplies, fresh gloves, bandages, the small glass vials of epinephrine arranged in their plastic slots like bullets in a magazine. Her movements were efficient and practiced, the kind of work nurses did 1,000 times without thinking. The disaster was exactly 17 minutes away. It arrived as a sound she'd never forgotten, the particular gasp of a body registering catastrophic pain. The cry came from down the hallway, not loud but sharp, the kind of sound that cuts through ambient noise and makes the nervous system recognize danger before the mind can catch up. Danielle's head lifted. Her eyes tracked toward the sound. Room for 12. The hallway was empty except for Kowalski, who had made it perhaps 40 feet from his room before something inside him tore. His hand was pressed against his chest, fingers splayed across the surgical dressing. His mouth was open. He was trying to say something, but his body was already deciding for him, already beginning the collapse, already betraying the repair work surgeons had so carefully stitched together just 72 hours earlier. Then he fell. His knees buckled like a newborn foal's, and the linoleum caught him on the way down, his body hitting tile with a sound like wet leather slapping concrete. Danielle was moving before conscious thought could interfere. Her legs carried her toward him at a run that was less a run than a purposeful sprint, the kind of movement that belonged in a combat zone, the kind of speed that didn't ask permission. Her scrubs whispered against themselves as she dropped to her knees beside him, her hands already moving to his gown, already lifting fabric. What she saw made everything else disappear. The surgical incision had dehisced, the medical term was sterile and clinical, but what it meant was that the wire sutures holding his breastbone together had failed, and his chest was opening like a letter, blood already pooling underneath his gown, soaking through the dressing in a bloom of crimson that was spreading faster than any medication could stop it. Worse. His eyes were glassy. His body was rigid. His heart wasn't beating. The absence of a heartbeat is a particular kind of silence, not peaceful, but the silence of a system shutting down, of a body making the decision to stop fighting. Around her, the unit erupted. A nurse screamed for the crash cart. Someone else was on the phone, their voice climbing an octave. Dr. Pierce emerged from the physician's lounge, saw Kowalski's prone form in the hallway, and froze for a visible moment, a micro-expression of shock that lasted perhaps 2 seconds before his training reasserted itself. He was shouting something into his own phone. Cardiology to the unit. Code blue, hallway outside 412. Get me the OR. His voice was loud, commanding, and entirely useless. He was standing 15 feet away, behind the desk, already calculating which liability form he would need to file, already composing the incident report. Danielle's hands were inside Kowalski's chest. She hadn't made a conscious decision to grab the scalpel from the crash cart, her hands had simply acquired it, the way a mechanism works without asking the engine for permission. The blade was surgical steel, sharp enough to separate tissue without shredding it, and in one smooth motion that belonged to a different woman in a different desert, she'd opened the incision wider, cut through ribs with the cold precision of someone who'd done this before while mortars fell and dust choked the air, and her hands had been steadier than they were now because in Kandahar there'd been no choice and no time and no possibility of failure. The sternum spread like a book opening. Her fingers found the pericardium, the thin sac surrounding the heart, and breached it without hesitation. The moment her hand closed around Kowalski's heart, the fluorescent lights above seemed to dim. Or perhaps that was just her awareness narrowing to the size of a fist, the muscular organ sitting in her palm like something from a dream, dark and slack and refusing to beat. She began the compressions. Not the external kind, the compressions they taught in ACLS with the heel of the hand on the breastbone. These were internal compressions, the kind you performed in the field when external methods had failed, when the chest was open and exposed and time was already writing the final page. Her hand moved in a rhythm that lived in her muscle memory, squeeze, release, maintaining perfusion, pushing blood through vessels that had been stitched back together 3 days ago, now broken again. There was no pain in her expression. No trembling. No moment of doubt. Her face was the face of someone performing a task, the way a surgeon looks when she's working, the way a pilot looks when the engines have gone quiet and she's gliding by instruments alone. Squeeze. Release. Squeeze. The heart was cooperating now, actually beating in her hand, its rhythm returning like a radio station coming into focus. His oxygen saturation, she didn't know the number but she could feel it, could sense the return of pressure in the vessels beneath her fingers, could read the language her hands were translating. Around her, people were running. The crash cart had arrived. Someone had brought the defibrillator pads. Cardiology was maybe 3 minutes away, which was 3 minutes they didn't have, except they did now because the heart was beating and the blood was moving and her hands had become the bridge between death and whatever came next. The cardiology attending arrived with a team, and for a moment there was a strange hesitation, a moment where they registered what they were seeing, a moment where the gap between protocol and survival became visible. A nurse without a surgical license, without gloves, without sterile field, with her forearm disappearing inside a patient's thorax, performing the exact procedure that only surgeons were supposed to perform. The cardiology attending made a decision that took less than a second. "Let's go," she said. "We're taking him to surgery. Keep those compressions steady. Exact same pressure." Danielle kept moving. They wheeled Kowalski toward the OR with her hand still working, still maintaining that rhythm, the portable monitor beeping with a regularity that sounded like hope or perhaps like salvation, depending on how you listened. The surgical team took over in the operating room. Her hands came free. Her arm, from elbow to fingertips, was covered in blood, not splattered but covered completely, as if she'd plunged it into crimson water. She walked to the sink without being told. Washed methodically. The water ran red for a long moment before clearing. She was still in the hallway, still in her scrubs, when Dr. Pierce appeared at the end of the corridor like a figure emerging from a photograph. His expression was not one of gratitude. It was not one of professional respect. It was something colder. Something calculating. His eyes moved across her, the blood that was already drying on her skin, the scalpel in the crash cart that was notably missing from its sterile wrapper, the fact of what she had just done in front of a hallway full of witnesses. He turned away and walked back toward the physician's lounge. His phone was already in his hand. She understood, with the clarity of someone who'd survived fieldcraft and bureaucracy both, that he was composing something. That he was already writing the narrative that would explain her, excuse her, contain her. That he was, in his way, scared of her. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at 2:37 p.m. when Danielle was called into the HR office. The room was small, institutional, with a plant that hadn't been watered in weeks and a chair across from a desk where 2 administrators sat, one HR representative with pursed lips and a tablet, and Dr. Pierce, who was not typically present at these meetings but whose presence here was not a surprise. On the desk between them was a printed incident report. She could see her name on the header. Could see her photograph from her badge clipped to the corner of the document. "We need to discuss what happened this morning," the HR representative began, her voice taking on the particular tone reserved for conversations that were not actually discussions. "Dr. Pierce has filed a formal incident report citing protocol violations, practicing beyond scope of practice, and potentially endangering the patient through unlicensed surgical intervention." Danielle sat down. She did not argue. She did not explain. She understood, in a way that transcended words, that this moment had been set in motion 18 years ago in a desert that still lived inside her chest. That every choice she'd made to be invisible, to be ordinary, to be just a nurse in Colorado Springs had been preparing for exactly this. "I'm recommending immediate termination," Dr. Pierce said, his voice steady, professorial. Her actions, while superficially appearing heroic, violated Colorado Nursing Practice Act Section 12-255-4, Hospital Protocols 12A and 23F, and created an immediate liability exposure to this institution. She performed an invasive surgical procedure without license, without authorization, and without proper sterile field. The patient could have contracted necrotizing fasciitis. He could have died from surgical contamination. "The patient is in post-op recovery," Danielle said quietly. Her voice was flat. Informational. Vital stable. Cardiac output restored. He was in full cardiac arrest. He would have been dead in approximately 4 minutes without intervention. That's not your decision to make, the HR representative said. Your role was to call for help, not to provide it. The words hung in the air like smoke. Danielle understood them completely. Her role was to call. His role was to ignore the call, to stand behind the desk, to file the paperwork. Her role was to be invisible. Her role was to survive by becoming small enough that no one would ever notice what she actually was. Effective immediately, you are terminated for cause, the HR representative continued. Security will escort you to your locker. You'll surrender your badge, your access card, and any hospital property. You have 8 minutes to collect your personal items. The walk to her locker took longer than 8 minutes. Security followed at a polite distance, the way they always do when they're waiting for someone to break, to cry, to give them a reason to move faster. Danielle packed methodically. Her lunch bag. The photograph of her son in his high school soccer uniform. The small faded unit patch that she'd sewn into the interior lining of her jacket 17 years ago, the one with the call sign she'd buried, the one that had been waiting inside her pocket this entire time like a secret she couldn't afford to keep. The security officer walked her to the parking lot. The afternoon sun was bright and ordinary and completely indifferent to the fact that Captain Danielle Ross, who'd spent 3 years building an invisible life at St. Michael's, who'd spent 1,000 days becoming small enough to disappear, had just saved a man's life and been fired for it. She drove home in silence. Her hands were still steady on the wheel. The incident report was filed within 47 minutes. Dr. Pierce stood at the nursing station, chest heaving, the words "practicing beyond scope of licensure" typed in clinical fury across the screen. His fingers moved like they were conducting surgery themselves, each keystroke a scalpel. He wasn't wrong about the regulations. That was the terrible part. He invoked Section 12.4 of the Colorado Board of Nursing Standards, Emergency Interventions Limited to RN Scope. He invoked Hospital Policy 847C, which required physician authorization for any procedure beyond assessment and medication administration. He invoked an obscure state statute, subsection 3, that classified thoracotomy as a surgical procedure regardless of context. 3 regulations, each one legitimate, each one a brick in a wall designed to bury her. The termination case was airtight. Pierce had documented her emotional involvement 3 weeks ago. He'd flagged her disciplinary history on the unit board. He'd created a paper trail so meticulous, so devastating in its precision, that HR had no choice but to comply. By 11:15 a.m., a woman from Human Resources named Carol, who'd never seen Danielle's hand save a man's life, was pulling her into an empty conference room with 2 security guards standing outside like bookends. "Captain Ross, St. Michael's is terminating your employment effective immediately," Carol said, sliding a document across the table. The word captain felt like a knife twist. Nobody here used that title. Nobody here knew it was real. Danielle didn't look at the paper. Her eye stayed on Carol's face, steady as a tactical assessment. The composure came automatic, the same flatness she'd learned in Kandahar when bad news arrived during briefings. You didn't react. You listened. You survived. The incident this morning constituted practicing medicine without a license, Carol continued, her voice rehearsed. Performing a surgical procedure on hospital grounds creates massive liability exposure. We have no choice. 3 words came out, measured and quiet. I understand the situation. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact delivered by someone who'd survived worse than losing a job. Carol looked relieved. Most people cried. Most people argued. This woman just sat there with her hands folded on the table, wearing scrubs that had someone else's blood drying on the sleeve, and accepted termination like she'd accepted ambushes in hostile territory, as a thing that happened. The drive home took 37 minutes. Danielle's hands were white on the steering wheel, not from shaking, but from gripping so hard her knuckles had lost blood. The scrub stuck to her skin. The June sun hammered through the windshield. She'd been ordered to disappear after Kandahar, after the operation that officially never happened, after they erased her records from public databases and gave her a new social security number with explicit instructions never to surface, never to claim credit, never to acknowledge the 8 soldiers she'd carried through 3 miles of ambush fire. She'd kept that promise even though it meant swallowing every accomplishment, burying every medal in a wooden case at the back of her closet, becoming invisible in a uniform of scrubs instead of desert tan. She'd surfaced today to save a man's life. And now they were pushing her back into the dark. The kitchen was too quiet when she got home. She sat at the table still wearing the scrubs, the afternoon sun falling across her forearms like an accusation. Her hands looked foreign in that light, smaller somehow, despite the calluses, despite the scars that told their own classified stories. She didn't cry. Not yet. Crying came later, in private, where it didn't violate operational security. Her son came through the door at 2:22 p.m., backpack slung over one shoulder, and stopped dead. Danielle was never home before 6. Never. In 14 years, she'd never been home at 2:36 in the afternoon. He dropped his bag. Mom. She opened her mouth. The question came before she could answer, "Why are you home?" The words she needed were all classified. They belonged to redacted reports and sealed files and conversations that had happened in concrete bunkers with no recording devices. She couldn't tell him about Kandahar. Couldn't tell him about the 8 soldiers, 6 Marines, 2 Air Force pararescue medics, who'd been pinned in a valley with their blood draining into sand that swallowed it like thirst. Couldn't tell him about carrying the heaviest one for the last mile even after her ribs cracked, even after she knew one of her lungs was filling with fluid, even after she understood that stopping meant they'd all die in that valley and the operation would be scrubbed from history like it never existed. She couldn't tell him about the medal locked in the back of the closet. Couldn't explain the unit patch sewn into her locker jacket, a patch that represented 3 years of her life and 18 soldiers she'd trained with and 7 she'd lost. Couldn't help him understand that she'd saved a Green Beret this morning using the same hands that had saved his father, because his father had been on that same patrol in Kandahar, and she couldn't say any of that without committing treason. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice was steady. That was the training talking, never let them see the damage. Just a difficult shift. But her son was 14, and he had her eyes, and he could read the space between words like he could read the ocean's undertow. He saw the tears she wasn't letting fall. He saw her hands trembling not from fear but from the effort of holding everything down. "Mom, what happened?" She opened her mouth again. Closed it. The classified conversations were louder than anything she could say out loud. She just shook her head, and something in that small gesture, in the refusal to explain, in the weight of secrets she was carrying alone, made her son sit down across from her without asking another question. The silence stretched between them like the kind that happens before an operation launches. The kind where you know someone beside you is afraid but you can't acknowledge it because acknowledging it means it becomes real. Outside, the Colorado wind moved through the trees. Inside, a mother and son sat at a kitchen table, and all the things she couldn't tell him were louder than anything spoken. The morning light filtered through the lobby of St. Michael's in soft bars of institutional white as a 14-year-old boy walked through the main entrance carrying something that changed the trajectory of everyone inside. The wooden case was polished walnut, the kind used for things that mattered, and he held it the way soldiers hold rifles at funeral details, with both hands, with purpose. His mother had come home 5 hours early yesterday in her scrubs, tears on her face, unable to explain why. He'd spent the night thinking about what happened when strong people break. This morning, he decided not to let it happen. Security moved toward him, liability concerns, protocol questions, but the boy spoke before they could issue demands. "My mom got fired yesterday. They need to see these." The case opened like a hymnal, and the words died in the officers' throats. Nested in faded velvet, catching the fluorescent glare, lay 3 medals. The Silver Star, its face bearing a relief of George Washington. The Bronze Star with Valor, its oak leaf cluster catching light. 2 Purple Hearts, their deep purple enamel unmistakable. The boy set the case on the security desk, and people stopped moving through the lobby. Wheelchairs paused. Visitors lowered their phones. The medals sat in silence that sounded like held breath. Within minutes, a crowd had gathered, not frantic, not chaotic, but dense with the weight of recognition. A nurse who'd worked 3 years at St. Michael's was standing in the parking lot somewhere, probably sitting in her car, still unemployed. And her son was standing here showing the world that she'd been someone all along. A woman in scrubs pulled out her phone to photograph the medals, then stopped herself. Something about the gesture felt wrong, like taking pictures at a grave. The case stayed open. The medals stayed visible. The story was written in metal and ribbon. That's when Marcus Jenkins was wheeled through the lobby for his scheduled physical therapy session. He moved through crowds as if the world existed at a distance, his paralyzed body riding the hospital gurney like a passenger watching a landscape he'd forgotten. His eyes registered light, sound, motion, the minimal awareness of someone whose mind had learned to inhabit less of itself. The physical therapist guiding his wheelchair began to navigate around the gathered crowd, apologizing quietly, when Jenkins's head turned slightly, the way an animal's turns toward a sound. He saw the medals first. Just the glint of them, the arrangement, the unmistakable geometry of military honor laid bare. Something moved in his face that hadn't moved in 14 months since the roadside blast in Kandahar province had severed his spine and left him in this half-awake state. His lips moved. No words at first, just the shape of breathing, the shape of trying to pull something from a distance. Then, whispered like a prayer, Angel 6. The nurse reading his chart froze. Her hand stopped mid-notation. She looked at the medals, then at the boy, then at the man in the wheelchair whose eyes had suddenly found focus, whose face had suddenly found history. The chart hung from her hands like a confession. She pulled up the employment file on her tablet, scrolling to the section marked Medical History and Military Service of Discharge Patient Family. The text read like testimony: Captain Danielle Ross, United States Army Special Forces, 1st Battalion 5th Special Forces Group. Citation, for extraordinary heroism under fire in Kandahar Province, 2009, risking life and limb to extract fellow servicemen under sustained enemy attack. Official commendation, Operation Guardian Angels, classified designation. That's when Dr. Pierce burst from his office like a man whose foundation was shaking. His face had gone the color of wall paint. This is a violation of hospital protocol. That information is restricted. I'm calling administration, I'm calling legal. His voice rose with each step, each word climbing in pitch the way drowning men claw at air. He moved toward the medals case, arm extended, reaching to close it as if concealing them would make the truth disappear. This is a breach of patient confidentiality, this is completely inappropriate, this is... The voice that cut him off came from the entrance doors, and it carried the weight of air pressure changing. A 2-star general in dress uniform stood framed in the morning light, his insignia catching precisely the angle that made them impossible to ignore. He wore his blues with the geometry of someone who understood uniform as a form of statement. His eyes moved across the lobby, the medals, the crowd, the boy, Dr. Pierce's extended arm, and he saluted. Not Dr. Pierce. Not the hospital administrators who'd suddenly materialized in the doorway. He saluted the faded Special Forces unit patch that someone had found sewn inside Danielle's locker jacket, now held by the boy with the same reverence his mother had always shown it. General Morrison, Pentagon liaison, the 2-star said, his voice like a tank idling in a garage. He turned to the hospital administrator, whose face had gone the shade of someone learning they'd been standing next to the living room wall while the house was burning down. I need all personnel files related to Captain Ross's employment and termination. Now. Not in an hour. Now. What happened next was the machinery of consequence grinding into motion with the sound of federal authority exercising itself. Within 20 minutes, a pair of Defense Department investigators had arrived wearing badges that made Dr. Pierce's confidence visible drain from his face like water through a compromised hull. But they weren't there to review Danielle's files. They walked straight past the security desk, past the medal case, past Dr. Pierce's attempted explanations, and directly to the records room where 18 months of billing documentation sat waiting to be read. They began with the Paralyzed Green Beret's chart. Page by page, they traced a pattern that made one investigator look at the other with the kind of expression that predates words. Procedures logged that never appeared in nursing notes. Equipment billed that was never delivered. Physical therapy sessions coded for dates when the patient was sedated. The investigator photographed each page with methodical care. By noon, they'd expanded their search to every paralyzed veteran on the VA wing. 47 patients. 18 months. $2.3 million in phantom procedures. Dr. Pierce was called into a conference room with hospital legal, the federal investigators, and a representative from the state medical board. His hospital privileges were suspended before he finished explaining the first discrepancy. His medical license was flagged for emergency review before his attorney could finish advising him to remain silent. The FBI opened a criminal investigation for healthcare fraud and exploitation of disabled veterans, and Pierce's face went from the color of wall paint to the color of surrender. Within a week, he was facing 17 felony counts. Within 2 weeks, his attorney had negotiated a surrender of his medical license, full restitution, and 5 years probation in exchange for avoiding prison, a trade that felt like currency exchanged at the edge of a cliff. The hospital settled with the VA for $4.1 million. The state revoked his license with a notation that made his name permanently associated with the fraud. 6 months later, Dr. Pierce taught CPR certification at a community college for $16 an hour, explaining chest compressions to teenagers who checked their phones during his lectures. He stood in front of a whiteboard in a building that smelled like a vending machine and regret, and nobody in the room knew who he'd been or what he'd tried to destroy. They just knew he was thorough, accurate, and somehow sad in the way that people are sad when they've learned the exact boundaries of consequence. But that wasn't where the story ended. That was just the parenthesis closing on Dr. Pierce's existence. 6 months after the medal reveal, Danielle Ross ran the new Veterans Care Unit at St. Michael's, a position created specifically for her with full autonomy and a staff she'd handpicked from combat medics transitioning to civilian medicine. The walls were painted colors that weren't institutional beige. On her office wall hung the faded Special Forces unit patch beside a photograph, her son in his ROTC uniform standing next to Marcus Jenkins, who'd regained some movement in his right hand through aggressive therapy Danielle had designed herself. His daughter visited every Sunday. He still called Danielle Angel 6, and now she answered to it in front of everyone. A young nurse asked her one afternoon how she'd survived it, the humiliation, the firing, the years of hiding. Danielle looked at the photo on her wall, at the medals she could finally display, at the unit patch that meant more than all of them combined. She said 5 words that sounded like they came from someone who'd learned their truth the hardest way possible: power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. She taught her first class that afternoon, training combat medics in civilian trauma protocols, showing them how the skills that saved lives in Kandahar could save lives in Colorado Springs. In the back row, Dr. Pierce sat taking notes on compression ratios, completing his community service requirement, watching the woman he'd tried to destroy teach the next generation how to pull people back from the edge. Subscribe for more stories about the ones the system tries to erase, and comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who they were standing next to?